Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to talk about urban transformations in the Middle East, which we are specifically going to talk about Doha. Before talking about what happened in Doha, I want to give you a brief input on the theoretical aspects of how the production of space happens, whether it is a monument till to this urban form at a city level. And this is where I want to introduce you to one of the important theory of production of space by Henri Lefebvre. And in fact, he talks about in earlier lectures we did discuss about Martin Heidegger's work, we did talk about Bourdieu's habitus, we did talk about Neil Leeds' work, but then collectively it actually summarizes the whole context of the historicity of the space, and mainly his work, the Henri Lefebvre's work, deals with what is the mode of existence of social relationships. So he narrows down this whole discussion he underpins in that is spatial, because how these social relations occur and how they take place and how it is actually seen and how it is actually understood. He underpins into that is what in the spatial terms. So in his chapter Spatial Tectonics, because his work mostly deal with the social space, and in one of the chapter on spatial architectonics, he broadly talks about two aspects. One is the production of space in terms of monument or building differentiation, and the second aspect which he talks about, the second scale I would say, one is a monumental scale and the second scale is a more of a city scale, the city and genesis and transformation of urban form. So here the space, we are not talking from only a small building or a small space, but it goes back to a bigger scale of a mega city. In his early work, he talks about three kinds of spaces and how they are produced. The first one, he talks about the conceived space. Conceived space is often referred with the space produced by planners and political decision makers, and therefore based on knowledge and particular ideologies. For instance, if you talk about the way the Chandigarh is planned, obviously it has been planned with a particular vision. So in that way, that is where how the political decision makers and the planners looks at the modernity and the equality, the democracy into the planning process. Whereas the second aspect, he talks about the perceived space, which is produced by the spatial practice of all the users of the space. So how people start using the space. So that is where the perceived space he talks about, and this is where he brings back to the Bourdieu's habitus, sense of place, and the planning, the intellectual space is formed by the invisible degree of people's attachment to a certain place. So when this becomes a mirroring or a repetitive performances, so how the space is formed through an invisible attachment and a degree of people's attachment to a certain place. And this is where he talks about the subjective dimension of the space production is defined as a lived space, that is where the intuitious. And now I take you to a slightly different track, but still I would like to relate, because why I am going to talk today about capitalism and the communism, and when we are talking about why I am not directly jumping into the urban transformations in Doha, that you will understand a little later. So at the beginning of the industrial economies, the industrialization process, so one need to understand what is capitalism and what is a communism, and how different ideologies have shaped different processes of space production. So I need to introduce you to Adam Smith's work on who was an economist and who was a professor from Glasgow and in Scotland, and who have written the book of Wealth of Nations. So here he mainly focused on the liberalized economy, how it can lead to the economic progress of a state or a nation, and how it is related, like the same thing how Lefebvre have related with this capitalist economics and the capitalist ideologies into the social space, because he brings a tripartite ordering which assigns more or less an appropriate place to, number one, biological reproduction, number two, the reproduction of labor power, number three, reproduction of social relations of production. So basically here he's talking about the biological aspect of it, the reproduction of labor power, and the social relationship within it, and which can able to produce. But then coming to the Karl Marx, who actually written the Communist Manifesto, that is where he brings the kind of gap between the rich and poor, the bourgeois and the proletariat society, and how the gap is increasing. And that is where he talks about the class antagonisms under capitalism between the bourgeois and the proletariat would eventuate in the working class conquest of political power and eventually establish a classless society. That is where the birth of communism, a society governed by a free association of producers. Here in the capitalistic, the one side the rich become richer and the poor becomes poorer, so the gap is increasing. So that is where he tries to address this particular gap and how the communist society has a different role to offer the society, so that it can bridge the gap. Obviously it has been very much criticized at later part. Today if you look at it, very few countries are working on this philosophy. So I would like to show you a small video to understand the difference between this.
Adam Smith versus Karl Marx. This could quickly turn into a debate between the ideas of capitalism and the ideas of socialism, or the ideas of capitalism and the radical version of socialism, Marxism, or it even could turn into a debate between capitalism and communism, which derived from Marxism. Although these philosophers varied greatly in their ideas and philosophies, without them the Industrial Revolution would not have been what it is, and it would not have the effect today without them. Adam Smith. Adam Smith was born on June 17, 1723 in Scotland. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow, and he wrote the book The Wealth of Nations. In this book, he defended the ideas of a free market, free economy, and the three natural laws. Smith was a firm believer in laissez-faire economics, and he also thought that economic liberty would result in economic progress. At the core of Adam Smith's laissez-faire capitalist philosophies lies the three natural laws of economics. Law 1 is the law of self-interest. Law number 2 is the law of competition. And law number 3 is the law of supply and demand. Law number 1 of Smith's natural laws is the law of self-interest. This question is asked almost every day by most people around the world. The question is, why work? Why spend 8 to 12 hours every day working? The answer for most people is you or your family. Why do you go to school? To get an education, which will most likely lead to a better life, with more money, more food, and more luxuries such as vacations, electronics, and a better house for you and your family. Law number 2 of Smith's natural laws is the law of competition. A small family-owned shop opens up on a street with some other surrounding small shops around it. Unlike the other shops, this one sells dressers. We will call this store number 1. Store 1 has one worker, and they can make one dresser in the average of 3 months. So in January, a customer comes and takes away the dresser. Another customer comes and they order another dresser. And in April, the customer comes back and takes their dresser that they ordered. Business is going great for store number 1. However, in May, another store selling the same dressers opens up just down the street. We will call this store number 2. In July, store number 2 releases a dresser while store number 1 is still out of stock. Store number 2 continues to make dressers, and instead of waiting, one customer comes and takes them all at once. This causes store number 1 to make a better product. This causes store number 2 to make a better product, and they keep enhancing their products as the need for business increases. This turns into something like a game for the businesses. One store releases a product, the next store tops that, and the next store tops that. The more businesses there are, the more competition is created. Ultimately, this competition creates a better product. Law number 3 of Smith's natural laws is the law of supply and demand. The economy always has and always will be dependent on supply and demand. A dresser factory will always sell dressers, but it will be dependent on the supply and demand on how it will sell with the public. Supply meaning how many could be made with the resources that they have, and demand meaning the popularity that this product has in public. If the supply is low and the demand is low, the cost will stay constant, meaning no fluctuations, and it will cost to make the product, but not many will be made. When the supply is low and the demand is high, it will cost to make the product, and it will be very expensive to buy it. When the supply is high and the demand is low, it will cost little to make the product, and it will not be expensive to buy. When the supply happens to be high and the demand happens to be high, this is where Smith's third law takes action. Smith believed that enough goods would be made at a low price in order to keep up with the high demand. When the supply was high and the demand was high, this caused the economy to rise, and it makes money. A dresser factory can only make one dresser per every day. However, the demand for these dressers becomes very high in a short period of time. This relatively slow rate causes the public to be angry with the factory because they want more dressers. However, the factory can only make so many at a time. This causes the factory to change their ways, so the 1 per day quota is now turned into a dresser every hour. At the basis of all Adam Smith's beliefs lies a strong belief in laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire basically means to have the government leave you alone. They thought that the nations did not grow wealthy from tariffs. Rather, free trade caused nations to grow wealthy. Free trade is trade with no regulation and no government interaction. They thought that free trade would boost the economy and would make a lot of money. A combination of Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo created a new way of thinking called capitalism. This new way of thinking thought that companies should be private and that the sole reason to invest money was to create profits. Thomas Malthus thought that the population was increasing at a faster rate than the actual food supply was. He also thought that people will always be poor if once poor. David Ricardo also thought that once you are poor, you will always be poor. He also thought that if there was a high number of workers and a high number of resources, the product will be cheap. However, if there's a low number of workers and a low number of resources, it will be expensive. Karl Marx was born May 5, 1818 in Germany. Coming from him came the philosophy of Marxism, which was really just a more radical version of socialism. In his book, The Communist Manifesto, he expressed his thoughts and the problems that he saw in the capitalist system. In his book, he discussed the problems with permanent social classes, and he also discussed how the poor will suffer because they will always be poor. He thought that human society always has been and always will be derived of social classes, and that these social classes will be permanent. He thought that once poor, you will always be poor. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx explained his views on social classes. He thought that social classes are permanent. Before the Industrial Revolution, he had workers on the bottom, the bourgeoisie or the middle class in the middle, and then wealthy on top. After the Industrial Revolution, he thought that the workers were going to be on the bottom, the middle class in the middle, and wealthy on the top. However, he had a gap between the wealthy and the rest. He thought that the wealthy were going to grow even wealthier, and that the poor were going to grow even poorer. With the distribution of money with extremely wealthy on the right and the extremely poor on the left. Before the Industrial Revolution, Marx thought that the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor were relatively close to one another based on the distribution of wealth. However, after the Industrial Revolution, he thought that the wealthy would grow extremely wealthy, the poor would grow extremely poor, and the middle class would lose some of their wealth as well. The poor worked in terrible conditions, and Marx thought that this would cause the poor, which was the majority of the population, to overthrow the factories. How Marx saw the future. Marx thought that the capitalist system was going to destroy itself. He thought that the factories were going to end up competing against the small family-owned businesses. While a small family-owned business can make one dresser, in the same time, a factory can make many different dressers of many different designs. Marx thought that this would completely destroy all family-owned businesses. He thought that all of the artisans would disappear. Marx thought that the wealth was going to be held in factories and manufacturers. He thought that because of this, the people would revolt. People would want their money, their power, and their equality back. He thought that because of this, everything would be shared, everyone shared, and everyone's profits would share. This would cause complete equality. The government would be held in the people. This new society would now become social class free. Marx described this point as a state of communism. Marx's stage of pure communism. Marx considered this stage the last phase in turning the society into complete socialism. In this phase, everything is owned by the people. Private property would cease to exist. All land would become owned by the people. All factory, mines, railroads, and businesses would also become owned by the people. All food and goods would become shared equally among all. There were very few immediate reactions to Marx's The Communist Manifesto. However, by the turn of the century, Marx's ideas of communism had spread all the way around the world. Marx's ideas of communism caused explosive results worldwide. His ideas affected many countries, including Russia's Lenin, China's Mao Zedong, and Cuba's Fidel Castro. Were Marx's predictions right or wrong? For the most part, they were wrong. Marx thought that economic forces determined and predicted the outcome of society. Turns out there are many factors, including religion, nationalism, ethnic loyalties, and a desire for democratic reforms. Also, Marx thought that the gap between the rich and poor would grow immensely. The gap actually did not grow because the government had enforced many new reforms that would prevent this from happening. Although the ideas of these philosophers varied greatly, our society would not be what it is without them.
So that's a brief about the capitalism and the communism between the Adam Smith's work and as well as the Karl Marx theories. But then how Lefebvre brings all this into the space production. So in fact, in the first aspect which we discussed about the monumentality, because he talks about how certain periods in history, especially with the dealt with the monumentality that took all the aspects of spatiality, that is perceived, the conceived, and the lived, and especially the monument monumental space offered each member of a society an image of that membership, an image of his or her social visage. So in fact here the monument itself is a kind of identity, it portrays its identity of its society. And if you look at the kind of the Roman civilization, how this whole the development of plazas, the development of monumental style of buildings, and how it portrayed the whole wealth of nation, and it's how the society it got an identity. So on a similar note, the capitalist society, by contrast, what it does is it no longer totalizes its elements nor seeks to achieve such a total integration through monuments. Here it balances, it tries to distill its essence into buildings, which is a kind of uniform in nature and which is a kind of competitive environments. So that is where the buildings displace monuments, and here the one of the important thing you have to notice is, and successfully combine the object of control by power with the object of commercial exchange. So how the law of competition, which he discussed, and the law of self-interest, and because that is where the commercial exchange, so where the noble class has gone and the merchant class came above, so that is where the bigger transition have happened, and that directly has an spatial impact. So and Lefebvre later, some point, he developed his second ontological transformation of space, and especially for him the long history is one of the important aspect which he looked into understanding the production of the space. So in fact the end of 20th century has marked an important beginning, especially the new industrial revolution and the world wars. So he actually looked at various historical approaches and how a new space started producing, and that's where he talked about the beginning of a new type of space that is more dominated by lived space and which considers as still being in its infancy. So what he names is, he names the first one is an absolute space, and the second one as abstract unconflicted space, and the third one he talks about the differential spaces. So here absolute space, it was a result of a human spatial practice, namely the physical interaction with the natural, how the society start interacting with the nature, and then how they develop their environments, built environments for their survival processes. And this is very less informed with the intellectual intervention or rationalized planning processes. Whereas from he also talks about from the when he is moving from the global level, he talks about the change of this absolute space to the abstract space through the analysis of the rise and fall of Greek and Roman societies, where the state-city empires have how they have risen and how they have fallen, and how the democratic ideologies came into it, and how it has impacted on the spatial forms. And that is where he talks about how the historical mediation between the medial feudal space and the capitalist was located in an urban space, because there's a huge transition between the kind of feudal space and the commercial exchange, how it brought this capitalist into the urban space, the space of those urban systems which established themselves during transition. So this is where, when there is a kind of interaction with these both top-down and the formal process of the capitalist societies, and that is where the city became the center of political power, and the spatial development became more and more administered and shaped by the rulers to enhance the functionality of its urban space. So that is where the conceived space, it goes back to what in his first analogy of conceived space, the space of intellect began to emerge and formed a new type known as abstract space. So from absolute, here we talk about a kind of conceived space or a kind of abstract space. Names for it are reducing the spatial aspects into functional and geometrical. So how it break into land parcels, how you divide into the whole city into different sectors or the fragments. And especially if you look at the World War II, which has a major impact on the whole world, especially if you take London or Japan or any other places. So how the urban planning was being often reduced to the calculation and implementation of physical planning that enables cities to accessible by car, because at the same time the car was invented, the waterways has a big impact. So there's If you go to London, you'll see how the waterways of that time was now used for leisure purposes. So there's spaces of leisure and spaces of labor has been produced. So that is where it is referred as the conflicted space, because the knowledge economies are also started up, and that is where it is not only the gradual processes, the sudden drastic changes, because invention of car and the whole network have changed the whole ideology of a space. And now we come to the Doha. So if you look at just 50s, half a century or a century before, Doha is a small fishing settlement. And it was actually a Almadan tribe and Althan tribe. So how they started settling there, and they had a kind of rivalry with the kind of Al Khalifa kind of thing. So it was a very small fishing village, and especially developed based on the climatic and geological conditions. And if you look at the Doha pre-oil settlements, before the oil was discovered or invented there, so in 20th century there were hardly about 12,000 inhabitants, and in 1930s the population have dropped from 27,000 to 16,000. You know why? That is where we go back to the capitalist ideologies of somehow a new market also have an impact on the population sizes, because that is where because of invention of cultured pearls in Japan, because being a seashore settlement, they have been investing in the traditional pearl diving methods. But now when the Japan has invented the cultured pearls, then this has also impact in the demographic status. So it is earlier called Al-Bida, which was an 8 distinct settlement which spread about 1.23, you can see in this map, 1.23 square meters, and you can see all the traditional houses of the courtyard buildings. And Al-Bida, today's name is referred as Doha. And in 1947 and to 1971, this is where in the previous place we talk about the absolute space, where the vernacular processes are involved in it, and how people have dwelled themselves, and how people have started developing the built environments. So here, when the oil has started pumping in, obviously the foreign migrants, especially people from South Asia, people from Western countries and Thailand, and many people, they started investing their businesses, and that is where it grew from 14,000 to 83,000 inhabitants, almost comprising 67% of foreign migrants. And that is where I think, as we just discussed before in the Lefebvre's work, how an abstract space, they talk about how a power talks about administration of the spatial production. So this is where they started about Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Agriculture, the planning with its town planning section in 1974, that was very recent, and Ministry of Public Works Department. And at the similar time, the same time around, the British consultant Llewellyn Davies was appointed to design the first master plan of Doha for 1990. So what he does was he developed a kind of this whole master plan was developed on a ring concept, which has a functional distribution of land uses, and each function has been associated with particular ring. And it's a ring road system. What you can see is a kind of ring road systems. And with this development process and implementation of the new master plans, the old Qatari settlements, they started moving out, and they were replaced and to the new suburban right, because if you look at it, this is where the Dukan, where the oil was found, and obviously the whole network is directed towards this, the economic network. And here, when this network is developing, and obviously there was an airport here which is close to the royal families. So till 1970s, the land subdivision or into parcels has been mostly from the MMD, the MMMA, and as well as the PWD. But now it's gradually coming into the Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare, as well as Ministry of Public Works. And this is where they are looking at the kind, because the people are floating, people are coming from various places, the businesses are expanding, and the local people are migrating to the suburbs, and a drastic expansion has started taking place. And this is the time and where American planning consultancy William Lefebvre Associates commissioned to develop the northern district of Doha. This is where we call a diplomatic quarter, and this Corniche has been developed. And it's also established the kind of Emir Divan, which is the end of the old Qatari village, and it established the kind of the modernistic and also the independent Doha. Symbolically, it was representing the independent Doha, and gradually the infrastructure have started connecting to the new suburbs, have started developing in Al Rayyan, Al Ghurra, and Khalifa. So, and then the Qatar University, in the new master plan, they started the Qatar University. So they have invested on the education system of it and the diplomatic quarter. So this is where, if you look at the contemporary Doha, so from a fishing man settlement and how it expanded to the whole, so you see the Qatar University and the whole stretch of new developments and the education city, and you see the whole processes have been expanding, and this itself has become a big economic hub. So this is where we move from the abstract space to a kind of conflicted space, because all of a sudden many things were happening and many developments were happening, and the knowledge economies were building. So now the fear is also, the planning dimension is, yes, we have an oil resource, maybe it can last for 100 to 150 years, but what next? How we can rely on the alternative resources, how we can invest on education, how tourism can be part of it, right? And that is where about 5 lakhs inhabitants in 1990s, it became to 1.5 million in 2011. So that is, and this is a phase where the Qatar looked at the liberalization strategies and how they have impacted on the urban structures. So, and in fact, they also looked into kind of investing on the sports and how it can bring the businesses, how it can bring various sectors, alternative mechanisms. And this is a phase where the multicultural activities, multicultural migrants are happening, there's little conflicts happening between different spaces, different communities, and this is where the establishment of Qatar Cultural Village, this is where the culture is also given priority in the planning processes. So what we are looking at, what we understand is, so from a very vernacular settlement of absolute, then we came to a kind of conceived version of abstract space, and now how the knowledge economies and how the unexpected challenges are also resulting into a kind of conflict, the conflicted spaces. And today what you see is Doha, is all the tall towers, and it's almost like a kind of any other European city. So Florian Wiedmann, as we have, and Ashraf Salma, who have worked on this work, in fact, they actually related the Lefebvre's work on how he categorizes spaces and how it is relevant in the study of the contemporary Doha, and how it has evolved from a fisherman village to the today's global market. So in fact, in 1800s, it talks about the absolute space, the very first settlement, and in 1936, when the oil have started, it has conceived in the abstract space evolved, and when it became the state independence from 1971 onwards, and the liberalization process have started, and that is where huge drastic changes have occurred, both demographically, spatially, and physically, economically, and that has resulted in the conflicted space. So now how they are expecting the future and what are the threats they are posing, and if the oil industry falls down, what are the impacts? So that is where the kind of economic diversification is happening, and this is where, and at the same time they also realize that now it is coming into the hands of foreign migrants. So how they are looking at the strategic Qatarization plan in 2000, and they also talked about how we can also integrate, because we have to work, we cannot isolate from the migrants because we have to work with them, and how we can integrate. So that is where the Qatar National Vision 2030 was planned, and which has been implemented in a stage by stage processes as a first 5-year strategy of Qatar National Development Strategy. So what we understand here is before understanding the transformation of Doha, just as a phase-wise, it is very important to relate with the Lefebvre's theory and how this absolute, abstract, and the conflicted and the differential space are very relevant in the study of Doha, and how space has produced and what are the various factors associated to it. Thank you very much.